Well, I want to thank John for setting this up, and it's quite an honor to be on the same panel as both Sheriff David Clarke and Nelson Lund, two people who I admire a lot. I wanted to talk about a little bit different angle here, and that is who exactly is affected by these different types of gun control laws there. You know, my research, anybody who's read it, one thing I'm convinced about is that police are probably the single most important factor for reducing crime. But the police themselves understand that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime's occurred. And the problem with a lot of these laws that are being passed, in fact, I'd argue almost all of them, is that they primarily disarm law-abiding good citizens, particularly poor minorities, the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime. So I thought I'd take a law that, or a type of regulation, background checks on private transfers that Hillary Clinton, according to WikiLeaks, is promising that she's going to be enacting by executive order somehow during her first 100 days, and talk about exactly how this works and who it hurts. You know, when everybody thinks we all want to try to keep criminals from getting a hold of guns, but what I don't think most people realize is what a mess the current background check system is. You can go to Hillary Clinton's website, and she said this many times, that there's 2.4 million dangerous, prohibited people that have been stopped from buying guns because of the Brady background checks. That's simply false. What she should say is that there have been 2.4 million initial denials. And there's a huge difference between those terms. I'll give you a simple example. Many of you may know that the late Senator Ted Kennedy was stopped from flying on a plane 5 times because his name was similar to somebody else, somebody connected with the IRA that the British had given us a name for, whose name was on the no-fly list. Now, would we count those 5 times as 5 times we stopped a terrorist from flying? Presumably not, right? They're mistakes. But that's essentially how they count the 2.4 million. We don't know exactly the right number because we can't get precise data from the government. But it's something about 99% or so of those 2.4 million denials were mistakes. Law-abiding citizens who simply had names similar to criminals or others that we wanted to stop from buying guns. Private companies do background checks on employees all the time. If they had an error rate 100th the rate of the errors that the federal government has, they'd be sued out of existence. And there's a reason why the federal government puts those types of restrictions on companies, and that is because they're concerned that the errors there would have disproportionate impacts on minorities. And there's a simple reason for this. When you buy a gun, you fill out what's called a 4473. You put down your name, your social security number, your address, and your birthday. When a private company does a background check, they use all that information. When the government does a background check, what they do is they use phonetically similar names. Don't even look to see whether the middle name's the same. You could have one person whose name is Smith, spelled with an I, and another person whose name's Smith with a Y and an E at the end. As far as the government's concerned, they're the same people that are there. And then they don't look at the social security number, they don't look at the address, they look at the birth date. Now, when you have 2.4 million people approximately that have been stopped, you're going to run into some people who may have really needed a gun quickly for self-defense. At least in the past, they would eventually go back and check most of these cases and realize after a year or something that they've made a mistake. But there are a couple things to point out here. One is that people tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. 40% of Vietnamese in the United States have the same last name. Hispanics tend to have names similar to other Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other blacks. About 30% of black males in the United States are legally forbidden from owning a gun because of past criminal history. Who are their names most likely to be confused with? Law-abiding, good black males who may be wanting to go and buy a gun to protect themselves and their families. So it's easy to go and fix this, okay? All you'd have to do is have the federal government have to follow the same types of rules for doing background checks that private companies have to do when they go and do background checks. I've brought this up to gun control advocates and to Democrats for 15 years. There's absolutely no interest in trying to go and fix this. Another type of problem that you have is the cost. When President Obama from the White House talks about pushing these laws, and after each of the mass public shootings, there's two statements that he makes consistently each time. One statement is that the United States is unique in terms of mass public shootings, and that's not true. I have a couple chapters in the book that shows that that's not the case. The other thing that he says each time is the one law that he calls for is background checks on private transfers of guns. Of course, it's one of these situations where if a reporter sometime would get the nerve to go and ask the president, could he point to one of the cases that he's talked about that it would have stopped, if his law had been in effect, that it would have stopped the mass public shooting, the president would have to say he couldn't name one. In fact, he couldn't name one during his whole administration that it would have stopped in terms of mass public shootings. In fact, he couldn't even name one in years before, at least since 2000, that it would have stopped. But yet we have these laws being pushed based on horrible events that the law would have absolutely nothing to do with stopping. But when the president talks about this from the White House, one thing you may not realize is that to privately transfer a gun in Washington, D.C., it costs $125 to go and do a background check on a private transfer. In other states, it's not as bad. In Washington State, it's about $60 to do it. In Oregon, it's as cheap as $55. You know, the point is, whether it's $55 or $125, those fees may not stop you or I from being able to go and get a gun, but the poor, minorities who live in high-crime urban areas, the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime, $125 here in D.C. may make the difference between whether law-abiding citizens able to go and defend themselves and their family or not. I'll give you something to think about. In 2013, when Colorado was passing its background check on private transfers, I got calls from some state legislators. And they asked me what amendment would I recommend that they put up there on the bill that was going through at that time. And my suggestion was to put up an amendment that would exempt people below the poverty level from having to pay the new state tax on transferring guns. In Colorado, you pay a state tax, and then you also have to pay the licensed dealer to go and do the background check. With the exception of two pro-gun Democrats in the state house, every other Democrat in the state house voted against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay that tax. How many taxes can you think of where Democrats will fight tooth and nail against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay? In Maryland, in 2013, they passed a new law for licensing and registration of handguns. It costs over $200 plus lots of time to go through the process to register and license a handgun in Maryland. I had similar conversations with state legislators there. They tried to put up an amendment that would exempt people below the poverty level from having to pay the new state fees and taxes that were there. Since the Democrats controlled 2/3 of both the state house and the Senate, they wouldn't even let the amendments come up for a vote in those cases. You know, again, you have to ask yourself, if these guys really wanted to go and get background checks passed nationally, and I talk to people when I'm in green rooms or doing debates. There's lots of gun control advocates I've talked to over the last decade, almost 2 decades. I've brought up time, at least for the last 15 years, I've said, look, you can reduce a lot of the opposition that exists for these background checks if you make just a few simple changes. Fix it so there's not these mistakes, so that you're stopping law-abiding good citizens from being stopped from buying guns. There's no excuse for overwhelmingly stopping poor law-abiding minorities from being stopped. And the problem has gotten worse under the Obama administration, because what's happened, at least in the past, the government would go and check to see whether they'd made a mistake. It may take a year, may take a year and a half for them to fix it. President Obama has removed every last single person who used to double check to see whether mistakes were being made on background checks. Nobody's doing that now. Now you can appeal. The process is relatively complicated. Most people are going to have to hire a lawyer to go and fix that. It costs thousands of dollars. Again, who are they stopping by having this? It's going to be primarily, disproportionately, middle income and poor blacks and Hispanics who are going to be disproportionately stopped as a result of having to go and hire lawyers to fix mistakes that are the government's fault that they shouldn't even be doing to begin with. Look, as an economist, if I believe that background checks reduce violent crime rates, and I don't, and I'm happy to talk about why that's the case and why the academic literature overwhelmingly doesn't find benefits for it, it would be a benefit for everybody, not just the individual who's going out and buying a gun. In fact, I would argue that the law-abiding citizen who's going out of his way to do a background check on a private transfer is kind of the last person you have anything to worry about. But as an economist, what I would tell you is if you believe, whoever you believe benefits from a government service should be the ones who primarily pay for it. And in this case, if everybody is supposedly going to benefit from lower crime rates, then it should be paid for out of general revenue. It shouldn't be just the individuals who are going and buying the gun. If you go and suggest to gun control advocates, you should try this sometimes, particularly if there's anybody in power, in an important position, a gun control group, just suggest to them that the background checks be paid for out of general revenue, all right? They will go nuts. It's like holding a cross to a vampire. And I think when you combine this with the fact that they have so strong, they fight against things like in Colorado or Maryland, the question is, they seem more concerned about passing rules that will disarm people, particularly minorities and poor people, than they are in getting it passed. Because as I say, if they could just make two simple changes, pay for this out of general revenue, fix the system so you don't have overwhelming mistakes, you would reduce a lot of the opposition. The third thing that they would have to fix to completely eliminate the opposition to these background checks would be to set it up so it wouldn't be creating a registration system. Because the concern is that, if you have background checks on all private transfers as well as the sales, FFLs have to keep, federally licensed dealers have to keep tracks of the 4473 forms that are filled out, even though the federal government's banned from creating a registration list. And after 6, 7, 8 years, you may have a future President Hillary Clinton who would decide, we're going to have some edict that in order to keep your FFL license, she's going to have an executive order requiring that they have to copy the forms and send them in somehow to the federal government or pass a law at that time. And you have kind of an instant national registration list of law-abiding citizens. The point is, I don't have time to go through this now, though I could answer in a question, and that is, we've had licensing and registration in Hawaii, in Chicago, in Washington, D.C., in New York. You can look at countries like Canada. But the places that we have information on, whether it's Washington, D.C., Chicago, D.C., or Canada, you just don't find any crimes that have been solved as a result of licensing and registration. It's a costly system, and again, it's just another way of trying to go and disarm law-abiding citizens and taking resources that the police could use in other ways that we know reduce crime and having them put in here. Well, I know you guys are probably here to listen to Sheriff David Clarke, so I won't take up any more of your time that's here. But I greatly appreciate the chance to go and talk. Thank you very much.